In this video, we're going to be talking about the remainder part of this process, getting high resolution meshes into Maya, and some ways that we can deal with reducing that. Creating the background mountains in a more art-directed way than I did with this. This was quickly procedural. This is just a test render. And of course, creating this atmosphere and these clouds. Now, we might be cutting a couple of corners simply because to detail everything step by step would probably take 2 hours. So I'm going to give you as much of the information as I think that you will need, and you can always post some questions. Okay. Companion software. Most height map information needs some kind of companion tool. They need companion tools for rendering. They need companion tools for detailing. ZBrush is a really good companion tool for a couple of reasons. Number one, with height maps, you're dealing with flat planes which push vertices straight up, and they don't see the sides, so they're a height map, right? And when you push a vertex up, all you have is this edge along the side. It doesn't have any actual subdivisions in there to add detail anyways. So taking it into ZBrush, you can of course convert these using Dynamesh or ZRemesher, and you can build additional detail into those side cliff faces, which you can then sculpt with, regular hand sculpting tools, or with alphas and whatnot that you've purchased or made yourself, or you can always kind of collect real-world data using tools like Meshroom, which is a photo scan, like a photogrammetry or grammetry tool set, etc., etc., etc. So you can add detail to those side panels, and that's one reason why you should have ZBrush in your kind of arsenal. The other is right here, Z plugin Decimation Master. Decimation Master will, you go in, you pre-process the current or all meshes. If you have multiple meshes, you can set a percentage of decimation or max kind of values, and then when you're done, you decimate current. The reality is this pre-process is where all the stuff happens. When you click this one, it'll kind of blip for a little bit, and then suddenly it'll be done. Whereas this one, it chews through for quite a while. You'll see the bar sort of fill all the way across, and the higher resolution the mesh, the longer it takes, obviously. So what it does is it looks for any areas in the surface, and it reduces them as much as possible without eliminating data. And this is important. We don't want to lose information in the reduction process. We want to maintain as much of it as possible. Now, there is one thing that you will lose, which is your UVs when you generate them. And yes, we can generate them in here, but there's a much faster, simpler way to do that in Maya, which I'll quickly show you. So you import the mesh, you decimate, you process, and then you go ahead and export the mesh back out. Once done that, you will find some interesting things. So first, the 4K export from Gaea that I did was 3.86 gigabytes. So if you want to see the bytes, it's there. And once I decimated it, without losing detail, mind you, so it was still fully detailed, it went down to 293 megs. So a significant drop, like really significant. Another factor is I also exported a 2K mesh from Gaea, which is all quadrified, and the decimated mesh is still less polygons than the full 2K, and yet it contains more detail. So it's a really relevant way of detailing anything that you want and still being able to potentially use the mesh. So 6.7 million triangles is not kind of against the rules for importing into Maya. You can go lower res, but I wanted a lot of that detail in that silhouette, and so I did. And when I go for stuff further away, I will do, maybe like a 2K mesh or a 1K mesh, and I'll decimate that, meaning that I'll also have a decimated version of those things. So you can get all this detail in there from the actual polygons without having to do anything else. So I showed the other methods of just bringing across the data into Maya. This is another way of doing it. while maintaining the mesh. Inside Maya, of course, once you bring in your mesh, it'll be much huger than this, as you've seen in the other video if you watched that. And really simple, just go into UVs, planar map, and you have the y-axis bounding box, and it will give you exact same UVs as what you had from Gaea. You can apply your material or your textures back in, all your masks, everything will align properly. So that's it. And other things that, again, watch that Maya export video, because it'll talk about doing the things like reversing the UVs, softening the edge, and unlocking the normals in order to make sure that your mesh looks right. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about is we'll go a little bit more involved in, because there is no existing video for this yet. So I'm going to go with, say, 100, and we'll scale that up. And we'll go to the sculpting tools. And what's great about this is that we can go ahead and sculpt to our heart's content in context. So we could have our scene in here from our camera angle, and we can take that off and make a new camera that we'll use for sculpting. But this original one will do a tear-off copy, and so you'll have this one here, that's our camera angle, and then over here our new one. Let's just shrink this down. Normally I would have this on my second screen. So that's the direction I'm going in. So I'll take this and I'll make sure that it goes height information. I'm going to make a height map. So it's important that you work from a square, and then you can go ahead and say, okay, there's something here. That. There. That. And then from a three-dimensional standpoint, we'll get some of these forms kind of going forward. Because sure, they're, potentially going to be ridge-based, but and this way you can kind of define your balance, use control, maybe pull that one down a little bit more. And all I'm really looking for are basic formations. Something else that you can do with this is if you have your lighting here. Oops. Brush is confusing me. And we will press 7. Under lighting, we'll add shadows. So we can have our lighting in our scene. And so as we're sculpting this stuff out, we can even work from this viewport as well. We can see in context what's being generated. So anything outside of the frustum is not necessarily useful for us, but if we have a camera move on this, we can work with the camera move. So as the camera moves around, we can see kind of what the limitations, where the extents are, and continue to really design in context, which is really important for a shot, especially for a moving shot. You want to work on your composition, and your framing, and your camera, and you want to know what it is that's going to be seen and what's not seen, and how it's going to impact things like shadows, right? How is this going to look? So really basic lighting can go in there, and then you can take this and we'll scale it back down to 1. I'll create a little companion one here. Oops. I'll do my target. Another one is my source. And so my source here, I'm just going to create a quick cube and go 4 to go into wireframe mode. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to scale it by 10 and drop it by -0.5. So something like this. And just make sure it fits inside that cube. We'll take this one, go to rendering, lighting and shading, transfer maps, and we will create a displacement. And so I've got a location that I'm saving it to. I've got a TIFF here. Got a resolution here. And you can pick whatever resolution you want. And then when you export this to your location, you're going to end up with an image that will be height information. So that height information you can, of course, refine. So click Bake, and you may or may not get an error here, but that's not the end of the world. So just loading it in Photoshop here, image adjustments, levels, you can see the range that is produced. We can just make sure that that is well represented. Save that. So once in Gaea, you can quickly go ahead and grab a file node, drag it in, load your file. I tried playing with adaptive, but I didn't really get any real result from it, which is fine. And then I went through and adjust its influence to 0.5 to get it to something a bit more close to what I wanted, which when I apply gamma will correct it as well, because the way that this tool is reading gamma. So this is a previous sculpt that I did. It's not the same one that we did here. I just have the scene pre-prepared to make things go faster, and you can see all the detailing has gone wrong This is, this is not anything but just pixel resolution banding, but this is where the heal tool comes in. So the heal tool, I brought it up quite high. You'll notice that between here and here you get a pretty nice smoothed out result, and that's what it does, is it goes ahead and smooths things. And it's not quite the same as a blur because I haven't lost volume. If I had blurred this, chances are I would, start to lose volume. So the volume is maintained, and yet I get a softer end result. I then apply a little bit of aperture, and the aperture is going to go in and pinch some of this. So I've got it set to contract and 2 iterations, and so I'm getting some creasing on those top areas that I was playing with, sculpting wise. And then a quick pass of landform with really low displacement. So just drop the overall displacement so it doesn't change the shape too much, because I created all this stuff in context and I want it to look good. So this adds detail to it, but it's not quite there yet. So similar to what I did in the first video, I went ahead with some cells to get this one element, and subterrace, and we've seen that in the previous one, stratify, and we combine one set and another set. And you can do different proportions of each, trying different things to see how they resolve this. And then I took it through a landform once again. And so the difference between my original shape and my new landform is not hugely different overall, but there is a lot more interesting detail in here, different forms, and it's looking a lot more like rocky structures than just height blobs. So we'll go ahead and combine that back with the original landform. And by combining them together, now what we have is something a little bit closer to what we started from. So from there to there, even less variation on it, but a lot of detail in that surface. Rocky outcroppings and little bits. So add some snow on that. And there we go. And then just test that visually just with a quick clutter node. You can see the end process. We've got ourselves some nice mountains and snowy terrains, and they were all built in context, which is the most important part. I know that when I take this out, dump it back into my scene, this is going to be, what I wanted. Now, what is also interesting is that along with the tools like Decimation Master, what I can do is first in Maya take it in, and I delete this portion, re-export the OBJ, and then go ahead and decimate it on top of that. But I have to remember that I only have sort of half of a original surface. So there's another tool I'm going to point you to that you can use to help you get your UVs. So if you have the original shape, which you will because you built it in context, let's go back to 1. It will be very close to the shape that you've created to begin with, right? 0. And what you can do is by grabbing that mesh and your new mesh, even if it's kind of cut in half, it's under mesh, transform attributes. And by default, it will transfer the UV sets from one to the other. So because this already had UVs to begin with, which are very similar to those that are based in Maya, you can still have that half UV set rather than going and doing what I did in the first place, where I just did a projection. Or you can do that projection first and then delete it in half and afterwards. So you could decimate it. The risk of decimating it before you delete it in half is that these could be big triangles and you may not get a clean edge. So if you want that clean edge, you have to do it when it's still essentially in nice even lines and then decimate afterwards. So this transfer attributes will transfer the UVs from one to the other, and then you just have to delete history and you should be good to go. It can be a little bit slow on really high resolution meshes, but again, these don't have to be super high res because they're in the background. So that's the way that you can deal with that. So last but not least, the atmosphere. Go to Effects, Fluids, 3D Container. Let's go to Attributes on that, to the top. Okay, first off, I'm not going to make anything dynamic in this particular case. This is all static. So I don't need any boundaries, I don't need any velocity and that kind of stuff. And just make sure, I like to turn stuff off on the off chance that it impacts anything. It shouldn't, but just in case I like to turn it off. So the shape will be different and variated, but otherwise not. This resolution is important for shadow detail. So if you want really nice shadows coming through the volume, you have to increase the resolution. If you don't care about the shadow detail coming through it, so volumetric shadows going through this form, then you can leave this low resolution and it won't affect the appearance of your stuff when you render it. The reason for that is we're going to actually be using 3D texturing. So if you look under the textures, we have the ability to texture opacity, and all of this is a 3D texture which actually effectively impacts your fluids. So it actually cuts out. So it's the texture that has all this resolution, not the actual form. So the voxels are not necessarily relevant in this particular case. So this is just about shadow detail. That said, in order to preview it really nicely in real time, you do have to increase the resolution. So I'll take this up to, I don't know, 50. I'm just going to do, oops, 550. Uh-oh. My poor ancient computer was going, oh my god, man, what are you doing? I usually don't go above, say, 300, typically speaking, for anything really detailed. And 300 was, I think I did that for an atmosphere of a planet, to do all the clouds over on top of a sphere, to give the illusion of it having its own atmosphere on the planet. Anyways, moving along. We can increase dimensions here. Let's go like 100, and another 100 there, and maybe 20 there. And this is sort of our bounding box for our atmosphere. And what you want is, when you see at the edges of your volume, not necessarily to see these edges visibly. You want to see it go off into depth, however far you planned on building to. But you don't necessarily want to see these boxes. So when you have your cutoff in there, what you want to see is something like that as opposed to that, because sometimes those can be visible. If they're not, great, but that's something to be concerned about. The other thing that you can be concerned about is the top of the volume, depending on what you're doing. You can always increase that and work with that as well. So I'm going to go 5, 6 to go into shaded, then textured mode. Always just tapping 5 and 6. And let's give you kind of an overview of what's happening here. So we have our transparency, how opaque or not opaque this atmosphere is. So we're going to take that up. Right now it has a drop-off shape, but we'll look at that in a moment. We have, of course, the color, and we'll look at that. Then we have incandescence, which right now is set to temperature, but it means it's not affected by light, whereas this will be. And then we have our overall opacity. Now for overall opacity, I'm going to go ahead and we'll start off with a constant first. So constant is going to give me this full volume. I'm going to turn off the texture opacity for the moment because we're going to need that for clouds. But this is not the cloud volume, this is just going to be the atmosphere. So I'll take this one down, and because it's a constant value, it's the same thing all the way through. I'm going to take my color, and we're going to set it to a Y gradient. And in here, I'm going to start with my base color, which would be, say, nice blue color. Nice little sort of sky blue. And maybe down here our horizon, atmosphere, kind of like a cream color. So if you want to have that far off distance kind of horizon stuff, let's just go into our display here, and I'm going to turn off the whole boundary, just so we see the fluids rather than those weird green lines. Also in display, I'm going to increase the slices, and let's just stick something in that volume just so we have something to render. Turn off the grid. Have a lovely little ground plane. Yes, beautiful. Okay, so what this does is just preview in the viewport so that you get a better quality look. You can also increase the quality here should you desire, but it doesn't affect your render. So we've got that going on, and you always have to render this off to be sure of everything. I'm going to set this to a Y gradient now. So what we have here is the top is one value, and the bottom is another value. We can always refine this considerably. I'm going to take that back end and bring it all the way up. Add a bit of a curvature to that. So I'm trying to find that balance in there. It's not an easy balance to find. Favoring one or the other. Let's go 0.9, 0.96 maybe. There we go. And if we want, we can bring in some other colors into that upper region here. More into a blue. And what I can do with this is, instead of going to 1, I can go to, say, 8. And that's perfectly acceptable. It may not seem like it's perfectly acceptable, but it is. I'll just create a quick directional light. do a quick render. So what you're seeing here is, because this is low opacity, this volume here is still really dark, even though I've brought that light intensity up to a realm of 8. I'm just going to take my fluid volume and we're going to go 30, because I'm seeing the top of that a little bit too easily, and I don't wanna. About 40. So there we go. So this value if you want a nice bright sky, you're going to have to increase that number significantly. Now this will also be combined with something like a light source, like a dome light. So you may not have to go up to 20. This is here without that particular element in there. If I were to go ahead and lift this one, you can see my overall atmosphere becomes considerably brighter. And we can get, color ranges going from one set of values to another set of values. We can, let's say we're going from like an orange to a blue, and this is the reason why I'm using this instead of actual fog. If I were to use an actual fog from the AI atmosphere, I don't get as much kind of control over this. I don't have those 3D textures, I don't get the gradient colors, I don't get all those kind of things that I really want in this particular situation. So this allows me to establish sort of my overall atmosphere and get my depth on my mountains. Atmosphere is really what helps sell the sense of scale, and so if you don't have that, you lose on that particular aspect of your piece. It doesn't feel as big. So I'm going to stop that for a moment, and I'm going to set these back down to smaller numbers, just because in the context of our little world here, we want it to look like it looks like in the render, and deal with some control of some other things. I'm just going to turn this off. So we've got this volume, and it goes to full kind of opaqueness at the top, and what we want to do now is play with some of these other settings. So I told you I'd tell you about the drop-off shape. So the drop-off shape, we have things like, say, Z gradient. And so what it's doing is it's dropping off from maximum opacity here to minimum opacity over here. And I can change that gradient, just kind of scaling the gradient to get that fall off a little bit stronger. Now, because of these other elements in there, it creates this kind of wedge shape, which is not necessarily visible here, but you can pull everything kind of backwards, right? So you can use this to pull backwards that fog without losing it at the top. So if you needed to pull back that distance but still have it kind of fade in nicely, that's something that you can do. You can also do things like, make it a sphere. So the size of, that's not the one that I wanted. pulling on the wrong slider. So that's your, your fall off of the edges. So it's an additional transparency. And you have another transparency right here, which you could then go to gradient. And this will only work on render. I don't think it works in the view. So if I went to -y, yeah, we don't see anything. So I think it happens only when you render it. So we'll set that back to defaults. So those are the options that you have available to you with the initial pass of this information. So we'll go back to the cube one, which is just the fall off of the edges. Okay, next to deal with, I'm actually going to reset a bunch of this. Got my transparency. I'm going to bring this back down here. This is going to make it more opaque. The more opaque it is, the more it is impacted by shadows. So when light passes through this, light will only hit one side and you will actually have shadowing. So storm clouds and the like, you want to make it more opaque. If you want to get light fluffy clouds, you want to bring it up because then more light can transmit in through the volume. The second thing is, typically speaking, in these ranges, if you want somewhat solid looking but not light and fluffy, you also have to tend to use a combination of things like the color and the incandescence. The incandescence, what it will do is it will add additional light, and it can have the same kind of things. You can do stuff that are gradient based, so if you want to get all the edges lighter than the center, so the center seems like it's darker and more solid, you could play with that, so it's just kind of lighting the edges, or just the tops of it, or just the fronts or the sides, and you can play with the gradients in there. Also, you can deal with density where it's more form-fitting, so like the edges are distinctly brighter than others. You can play with that as well. And it's just a gradient. You just pick the colors. The darker the color, the less light it's going to add to it. The brighter the color, obviously, the more bright it is in the scene. We've already played with opacity. It's got all the same controls as well, so we can control each one of these different ones. So color, go to larger values in order to get more vibrance, brightness off of it, where it's still responding to light and shadow. Or if you want to overwrite shadow, use incandescence, and then you have your overall opacity. Remember that opacity works against these other ones in that as it goes lower in opacity, you may have other issues to deal with. Okay, I'm going to set this back to its normal settings. There we go. We can always open these up if we want to see a little bit better what's going on in here, and have a little bit more refined control. Okay, texturing. First, let's go to lighting. I'm going to turn on self shadow, and what this is going to do is simulate shadow in the environment. If you want the shadows to match one of your directional lights, just ask in the comments below, and I will make a video to show you how you can set up one light, your key light, one light as sort of the light source. It's just a rigging setup to link it to these values here. These determine the direction, and there's a little bit of technical stuff that you have to do in order to get it to match up, and then it'll always match your lighting direction of your key light. It's very important for me, at least, to see what it looks like in my viewport so that I know what I'm doing. Okay, so I'm going to keep this on Y gradient, and textures, texture opacity. So the texture opacity to 0. going to take this up to 200. Sometimes you'll just have to hit like this to jump to the first key if it doesn't update right away. And you already see something kind of fluffy as a volume. This is chugging with me recording, so I'm going to go to maybe 100. And we can always go back up afterwards. If I take my bias down, see it'll eat into that volume, and we can flip that around. To get the spacing between the clouds higher, we're going to take this one up. We'll add a lower area and a higher area. What this does is gives us sort of a wispy edge, and then it goes to more opacity towards the center, and then we can play with that bias, determining where we want clouds to exist and where we don't. Now on the texturing side, we have things like the depth max. If I press something like 6, you can see it adds a lot more smaller detail. Let's try maybe 7. And we're not seeing it all because we're only at 100 in terms of our resolution. At 200 you'll see a bit more, 300 see even more. But this is kind of a good starting point. And what we have here are a series of different values which control it, similar to what you would deal with things like contrast levels. And then there's these things regarding sort of the ratios of different levels of noise. So to give you a little bit of context on this, maybe a little bit difficult to describe verbally, but I'll give it an attempt. You would have things like mounds of dirt versus hills versus mountains, right? You have these different layers of detail. So they're all kind of the same general collection of shapes, but they're getting larger and larger in scale, and they're all kind of combining together to make one landscape. In this case, we're dealing with cloudscapes. And you can determine how much influence the small dirt mounds have on the overall fractal versus how much influence the big mountains have. So are the big shapes the more dominant feature, or are the small shapes the more dominant feature, where the big shapes just kind of add a little bit of larger variety to it? So you're trying to find that balance in between these different pieces. So part of that can come from that. So you can see where it looks like it's kind of getting larger, and we're playing with that ratio between large shapes versus small shapes. We have overall ratio of influence, and you can play with that to see like what ratio the noise has on this as is. And then we have things that control sort of like the contrast and levels kind of idea that you would deal with in Photoshop. So if you want to soften them but keep a lot of these smaller shapes, you can deal with it with threshold. And then there's an overall brightness where you can like take the whole thing brighter or darker, and so on and so forth. In addition, we have things like texture time. These can be animated to change and undulate. So if you have clouds going over time, you can do that. You can always go in here and say equals time asterisk for multiplication 0.3 or something like that. If I were to press play, it will go through at the speed of time multiplied by 0.3, so just sort of slow it down. Just kind of delete that expression. So you can do that. And you can do the same thing for changing the origin in X, Y, and Z, which will give you different movement of the pattern. So if I were to take this and kind of move it slowly across there. Here, let's go time, or sorry, start with equals time multiplied by 0.02. That should be slow enough to see it. So you see that it looks like it's kind of creeping off towards the right. We edit that expression, and we'll go 0.1 might be too much, but let's try it. Edit. There you go, that's not bad. So you can see that they're kind of rolling across there, and if you added a really slow texture time to that, then it would look like they're moving across the sky, but they're also changing in form as they move across the sky. So you can do that kind of idea. Depending on your resolution, will determine how chunky this will appear in terms of movement. So this is another area where resolution could potentially be sort of important overall. Let's go ahead and delete that expression again. And so going in y direction, negative or positive, so you can multiply by a negative number or a positive number to make it go up or down, left or right, forwards and backwards. With texture scale, you can either scale the volume or you can scale the texture. This is the x direction. If I did this to 0.1, let's say, you can see it sort of compresses, which can be interesting. And then you have the rotation of it, which is there. Then we have our implode, which has an implode center. And I'm not sure you're seeing it very well there. You see how it's stretching out at the edges here? It basically creates a center pinch volume, so everything kind of pinches towards or away from that value. And then you can change the center of where that pinch occurs, so where in that volume. So those are the basics of that. We also have things like inflection, which adds another level of complexity to the fractal. So somewhere in the math, I think, it adds another layer of a fractal in there, and then we could also invert this, and you'll get different kinds of results. Okay, let's go back up to 200. So you can see the details here and get a better idea of what we're looking at. So the big factor here is frequency. Frequency is kind of like an overall scale of the main fractal. It's not necessarily that, but it's what it kind of equates to. So if I want bigger cloud formations, like bigger chunks of cloud as it were, I want to go with the frequency, and it's going to give me bigger blocks. I can then play with things like frequency ratio and ratio to get even more sub breakup of these. You see they break into smaller sort of wispy chunks versus over here, update there, where the edges are tiny little chunks, but the center forms are a bit more solid. So you're playing with that balance between which has more influence, the smaller shapes or the bigger shapes. And then the overall ratio influence of the whole thing in terms of opacity, which will grow the forms outwards, sort of width, I guess, is the closest variation that I could apply to this. It's not what it is, but it's essentially what it would control. And your depth max is how small that can go. So playing with these, inflection versus invert, you get different variations on the shapes. So if you want sort of wispy clouds, you use one versus the other. There are some different noise patterns. However, these can be quite expensive. So things like billow, for example, takes much longer to calculate and render than all of the other ones. Some of them don't work for clouds. They're too mathematically generated to be useful in that particular context. There are potential uses for them, but not always for clouds. So you can do something like Wispy and Perlin and space-time for cloud-related stuff. The rest of them, not great. So billow, too expensive. You'll be waiting forever. So that's essentially it. The other factors to play with, again, is along that idea of, you know, the width of your clouds versus the space between them. You can play with this, which will kind of expand out the wispy region. May not be super visible here. You always, always, always have to render this off to see what it looks like in Arnold. It's not a direct one-to-one. If I go ahead and hit render right now, I'm not going to have quite the same overall shape. So if I go to Arnold Render, you notice that it looks nothing like what's up there. So you do have to preview it and make adjustments based on that. So it's very important. So the final thing that I will say here is often cases you need to deal with more than one kind of cloud system. So I would make one volume for, you know, one set of cloud coverage and then another for a different kind. If you look at the sky, there's often not just one kind of cloud covering everything unless it's like a really cloudy day and it's just overall cloud coverage. Often cases there's a mixture of different kinds of clouds, and you can control those in different ways using, you know, different opacity methods. You could use a circle gradient to make a singular cloud, like a hero cloud that you want to shape up. Or you could, you know, do a whole selection here like this, like we have here, but then use things like the Z gradient. Poor computer's going to freak out again. And we can control opacity this way. So what happens here is they're only reaching so far, and these ones become more wispy and they give way to another set of clouds and formations. Another thing that you can do with this, if I can get it to respond, just quickly lower that resolution so I can get some decent response off of this, is you can also get those sort of windswept cloud shapes just by scaling it out, and you get these sort of streaked patterns which can look pretty cool and have them fill that volume. So you can play a lot with these and just mix and match different collections of them in order to fill your entire sky, which is what I did for my final image. So in here I've got something with a really low see it, so I've got a really low frequency, so I get really large shapes from it, even though I have, you know, these balanced to get all the smaller details. So you can see all the smaller breakup and stuff like that that's coming from those, but this is a big volume because of that low frequency. It's also doing this cloud here and this cloud here, and then these ones are covering more of the volume by playing with these values in here and this input bias, as well as adjusting the ratio and threshold a little bit. And then I went ahead and did that Z gradient that I just did here on that so that it falls off, and allowed that to happen. I also used a higher value for the white in order to pick up some of these things, because they're really low opacity at the edges, and I wanted to pick up a little bit of that lightness, and it really wasn't that visible, so you have to increase that number quite significantly. So that's how I made that whole sky. We're almost at an hour in this video, but it covers everything that you needed to know in order to put this together. So again, the snow, I made use of the mask from Gaea, and allowed it to mask one region for brighter incandescence here versus nothing there. And you can also use that mask to mask off other things like, you know, specular roughness, one value here versus another value there, so on and so forth. So ways that you can do that to control things. Just quickly, just use the Lambert as an example. We can do it a couple of different ways. If we're having solid values, it's just kind of black and white, we could go with utilities, blend colors, and you have two different values here. They can be color information, or they can be just black and white information, although when you output it, you're going to have to pick the appropriate channel to plug that in. Then you take your mask from your file, so that would be a 2D texture file, and you would go ahead and take your black and white image, take one of its channels, and plug it into that blender, and that would blend between those two different things. And you would get, you know, those two different values, and you can chain those together one after the other, and then you can just plug that into any one of your inputs for roughness or specular or whatever, and you have this one range for one area and another range for another area. Another way that you can do it is you can use a good old-fashioned 2D texture ramp, and let's get it, or use a checker. It's black and white. So if I were to go into here and plug that into the V coordinate, the ramp suddenly becomes the checker. But what we have now is ability to control different values. For different areas. And that works really well if you want to have more control over different colors kind of in the in-between. So if I went for, let's say, cloth instead, which has a variety of values in between, so it's not just pure black and white, and plug that into the V coordinate, stick some green in here, and so you can see I have the red, the green, and the yellow range, and I can control those different regions, so you can color a lot more information in with a variable map. So similar to the idea of, say, a splat map, but you're using shades of gray. So in the mid-tones we have one value, in the dark tones we have another one, and so on and so forth. And so you can break this into more than just sort of two input values, whereas the utilities, blend colors, you can't just add another value and just, you know, say that goes into the middle. This only has the two values, and you just blend between them. So those are the two different things that I would use to help me sort of balance between. So the mask for the snow, I would say, okay, I have two roughness values. I have the roughness for the rock and the roughness value for the snow, and I could plug that in. Or I have an incandescence value for the rock, incandescence value for the snow, or specular, or whatever. So you can control those things in that way, and it's very useful. So as always, hopefully this was useful, if not a little bit long. For those of you that got bored, I'm sorry. But if you have any additional questions, you can throw them down into the comments, and I see if I can answer them, or if it maybe leads to another video where I detail one aspect of this in something a little bit more important. Okay,